Good morning, and to those who were with us yesterday over across the river, welcome back. And to those who are just joining us today for the full day of thinking about politics, dedicated to explaining and perpetuating the political insights of James Q. Wilson, welcome. Our first panel today is on crime and policing with a distinguished set of panelists. I will introduce the chair, or the chair designate, and then he will introduce the other panelists. I've been instructed to offer a few logistical pieces of information about today's events. For those of you who will be around at the end of the day and might be interested in going to dinner, we can do something informally. You might want to get in touch with me or Shep. We will make arrangements to accommodate whoever wants to go out to dinner at some suitable place at the end of the day. So don't feel bereft or left unattended to. And then the second point from Shirley G. Now that you've all brought your name tags from last night, and I asked Shirley this morning, what else do we need to do to make her happy? She said, have a good conference and enjoy yourselves. So when Shirley says that, you know everything's straightened out and in order. Okay, so what I want to do now is introduce Chris Foreman, whom I think I first heard of when Jim Wilson was telling me about this really adventurous student of his who wandered off to the North Shore of Massachusetts to study the fishing industry, which I think is what Chris's dissertation was on. And Jim had great admiration for graduate students who wandered off to places that most people wouldn't wander off to, and Chris certainly, I think, did that, and wrote compellingly about it. Chris has taught at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy since 2001, for more than a decade at the Brookings Institution, where he continues to be a non-resident senior fellow in the Governance Studies program. His books include Signals from the Hill, Congressional Oversight of the Challenge of Social Regulation, Plagues, Products, and Politics, Emergence of Public Health Hazards in National Policymaking, and then finally The Promise and Peril of Environmental Justice. He's been on the board of governors of the National Conservancy and a Fulbright Scholar in Armenia. I think with that, I'll turn the panel over to Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Okay. Like the Sundance Kid, I'm better when I move. And no, I'm not Armenian. So what I will do today is I'll offer a few remarks, and then I will introduce the panel. I'll introduce everybody at once, and then we will go to our first speaker, who will be Mark Moore. I think that if there is a hot seat to be had at this conference, we're probably occupying it. People may take issue with Jim Wilson's emphasis on the role of ideas in the creation of regulatory agencies, or the theory of voluntary association incentives that he developed with Peter Clark and applied in his 1973 book on political organizations. They may challenge the influential explanatory framework of concentrated and distributed costs and benefits that he developed and applied as an alternative to Ted Lowy's earlier policy classification scheme. But these are matters of pure political science, mainly of academic interest. I think that Jim's efforts taking him only into city and regulatory and interest group politics, or efforts to understand the forces that make government agencies generally hard to manage and even harder to change. Had Jim done only this, he would certainly have been well known and much respected within academia, but probably a lot less beyond it. Now, I was not a student of crime, nor were most of those who worked with Jim, save for, of course, the glowing exception of John DeLeo. For me personally, it was his insights into the management challenges that attend the policing and investigative spheres, elaborated in his books, Varieties of Police Behavior, sorry, and the investigators, and then blended into his 1989 treatise on bureaucracy that have most stuck with me and proved helpful in my own teaching and writing. I suspect the same is true for many in this room. The importance for policing of street-level patrol discretion and local political context, the distinction between law enforcement and order maintenance, between the tasks and cultures of the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Administration, all of these things have much to teach students, and I use them to teach students, even now, about the government that many of them will work in, or interact with, or attempt to influence with their votes. But of course, Jim also got into crime, or studied crime, which is mainly what made him a foremost public intellectual. My colleague, Peter Reuter, I often introduce him as saying, Peter does drugs. People often don't know what I mean by that. Peter's always annoyed when I introduce him. Specifically, Jim studied and offered a deeply considered perspective. Whether it was correct or wise in all facets is debatable, and I'm sure will be debated today, on the causes of crime and on the methods of its control that might be brought to bear. On both fronts, he inevitably courted controversy. Crime and its control are deeply contentious, and in the modern era, certainly almost inherently politicized. It is an arena in which misguided policy and improperly calibrated implementation will quickly become visible and readily prompt citizen frustration and mistrust. It is a realm of government action where enforcement resources and burdens, especially regarding the control of the predatory street crime that was always Jim's focal concern, these have virtually zero chance of being evenly distributed in the population. Indeed, I think it is always going to be true that whatever policies one pursues in this realm, they're going to make a difference for good or ill unevenly within a society, and that unevenness will be visible and may well be deemed objectionable. Jim's name is now indelibly linked to at least three influential strands of policy argument: incapacitation, order maintenance policing, and and I think much less controversially, his opposition to drug legalization. As to the first, as Jim wrote of robbery in the final chapter of Thinking About Crime, and I quote, "Were we to devote those anti-crime resources to a strategy that is well within our abilities, namely to incapacitating a larger fraction of the convicted serious robbers, then not only is a 20% reduction possible, but even larger ones are conceivable," unquote. Lock up recidivists. Again, this is a policy that, if followed aggressively, must necessarily have visibly concentrated costs or concentrated benefits. It is a policy taken to great lengths, as everyone here knows, with considerable adverse consequences for communities. Now, many of you doubtless saw the biting post-mortem reflection offered up by Glenn Lowry shortly after Jim's death in the Boston Review, titled something like, "Much to Answer For." I first learned of that piece when Glenn rather startlingly posted it in its entirety on my Facebook page, where I host a little bit of episodic policy discourse. In any case, it seems that Jim himself ultimately came to regret the turn that matters had taken with incarceration, and I'll leave that to my colleagues to talk about. Now, on the other front is order maintenance policing, or broken windows policing. That's an idea, of course, as you all know, associated most notably with Jim and one of my fellow panelists, George Kelling, who will discuss it. I merely want to say here that it too has been roundly criticized for a very long time, also in the pages of the Boston Review, although a decade ago, when it ran a piece by Bernard Harcourt based on his book Illusion of Order. I will not say much more about it now, but I expect that George will offer his own comments about the broken windows idea. Though I do think it's important to observe as we start out, it becomes clear when you read or reread, as I did just the other day, the Broken Windows essay, it becomes clear that citizens do want order, even when it doesn't reduce crime. The essay, I think, makes that point rather strongly. The second point is, of course, perhaps more famously, that reducing disorder might have some ameliorative effect on subsequent criminal activity. One of the things that I wanted to say about the piece, which I hadn't read in many years and which I just reread the other day, is I was startled, as I was telling George the other day, by the remarkably tentative and even speculative quality or aspect of the piece. There are a lot of maybes or might be's in there. It is remarkable that a piece so hedged and carefully couched would have been so influential. All right, well, with that very brief set of remarks, I think it's now time to turn to our panelists. I'll be very brief. There are times when redundancy is useful. I don't think it necessarily is in this particular case. We will hear in this order from Mark Moore, who is the Hauser Professor of Nonprofit Organizations and Faculty Chair of the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, founding Chairman of the Kennedy School's Committee on Executive Programs, a longtime collaborator and associate of friend of Jim Wilson's. Mark cannot remember, but I actually met him, or not met him, but encountered him for the first time in the 1970s when I happened to sit in on a few sessions of the famous crime and human nature course that was being taught at Harvard. Then we will hear from Mark Kleiman, Professor of Public Policy at the UCLA School of Public Affairs. He teaches courses on methods of policy analysis, on imperfectly rational decision-making at the individual and social level, and on drug abuse and crime control policy. His current focus is on reducing crime and incarceration by substituting swiftness and predictability for severity in the criminal justice system generally and community corrections institutions specifically. Mark was also a collaborator for a few minutes in a very interesting exchange with Glenn Lowry in the wake of Glenn's posting of his critique of Wilson, and I would commend that to you as something you might want to take a look at. George Kelling is a graduate of St. Olaf College, Professor Emeritus at the School of Criminal Justice, Rutgers, Newark University, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, formerly a Professor of Criminal Justice at Northeastern University and a Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Obviously, he is the co-author of the famous Broken Windows piece, which he will be addressing today. And then finally, David Kennedy is director of the Center of Crime Prevention and Control, member of the faculty of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, who designed the drug market elimination strategy for the High Point, North Carolina Police Department and earned him the 2007 Innovations in American Government Award from the Ash Institute for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School. I want to also finally commend to you the article, or the profile of David that was published, written by John Seabrook in the June 22nd, 2009 issue of the New Yorker magazine, which is a remarkable account of a remarkable career, one that has been extremely influential and meaningful, and it could never have been, as I was saying to David on the bus this morning, could never have been produced and probably could never be reproduced. So with that, I will turn to our first panelist, Mark Moore.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with, well, I guess one might say, in the presence of or in the church of Jim Wilson. It's a treat to have all the ghosts gather and all the spirits begin moving around again, and it sort of has this important, inspiring, and slightly disquieting effect. I was quite startled last night when I went home after listening to a lot of political science talk, which I was glad to hear because I'm so accustomed to hearing economics talk that I was really greatly relieved to hear some political science talk. But then seeing all my old friends and people that I've known over the years and begin thinking about Jim. And one of the things I've noticed as you get older is that older memories become more vivid than present memories. And so I found myself rolling around in bed until about 2 o'clock this morning with a whole set of images of relationships and activities and things that Jim and I had engaged in and started and carried out and stuff over the years. And so it's been quite a heady experience so far, and it's tended to distract me a little bit from the the purely intellectual focus of a conference like this, although I suspect that no conferences like this ever have only an intellectual approach and aspect, that there's at least part of the effort to understand and to celebrate the spirit of a man who we've all been importantly influenced by as well. So it's caused me to reflect a little bit on not only the work I did in criminal justice with Jim, but also the work I did with him in a large number of other areas as well, and to try to see what the combination of the work in criminal justice and the work in other spheres could teach us about the way in which we might go forward in doing our intellectual work, both in criminal justice and in political science and government more generally. And one of the things that always struck me as odd is that when I looked, it didn't seem like my career had any particular natural path. I started off in crime, and then I started working on public management, and then I started working on civil society organizations, and I was doing that all in the context of concern about politics and government, but my concerns about politics and government always seemed a little bit more philosophical than empirical at some level. And so it didn't make sense, it didn't cohere in any academic sense at all. And I was always a little bit worried about that because it was moving across a variety of boundaries, disciplines, and from empirical stuff to normative philosophical work and stuff like that. And I thought, there must be something pretty weird about me. And then I noticed that my friend John DiIulio had followed exactly the same path, right? From essentially a study of crime to a study of bureaucracy and public management to a study of civil society organizations to a study of politics and the construction of society and stuff like that. And I realized that that was the path that Jim had followed as well, not necessarily in that order, but the swath that he had taken in had included each of those elements as we went along, probably from a little bit more academic disciplinary focus than public policy or practical focus that John and I were following at that time. But it was all of a piece. And it suddenly occurred to me that I didn't think that was an accident. As they say in Marxist theory, there was no accident that, right? And so the question is what in the world was the immanent logic that was bringing us across that particular swath of intellectual terrain? So here's my thesis. My thesis is that Jim entered the crime issue and the criminal justice issue as an important practical problem. And both he and John and I and others joining me, my friends sitting on my side here, found in that a huge number of important problems to think about that were intellectually compelling and practically important and largely underexplored. And so there was a lot of both intellectual and practical work to be done in helping to reconstitute, reorganize, refocus, et cetera, the nation's approach to crime and criminal justice. So it was an important practical problem that we could work on. But I think equally was important, I couldn't get the right word. You all know the right word for this, but I couldn't figure it out. I wanted to say a lens, but that's not quite right, or a crucible, but that's not quite right, or as a locus where one could clearly examine the operations, both the possibilities and limitations of a liberal democratic society. Because it was in the criminal justice system that some of the most enduring issues about the constitution of liberal democratic societies revealed themselves, right? What was the relationship between individual citizens and the state? How was the individuals going to join together to get control of legitimate state action when it was being taken? How did individuals work out collectively a moral idea that would order the relationships with one another and give legitimacy to the enormous power of the state. I think what I was struck by is, as our chairman was introducing us and reminding us of Jim's contributions, is that each one of the things, that is the incapacitation, order maintenance and policing, and drug criminalization, are controversial precisely because they seem to expend a great deal of state authority in the accomplishment of a public purpose. All right? What makes them distinctive and problematic from the point of view of most citizens at that time was that we were spending, if you will, the authority of the state a little bit more recklessly than most people thought was appropriate. And one of the things that always taught me about was thinking about the authority of the state as an asset that could be used to accomplish public purposes, right? And then being concerned about, as a liberal political theorist would have to be, exactly what would justify, both as a theoretical matter and as a practical matter, the use of this state authority, and understanding that there was a certain tension between the things that might justify it as a theoretical matter and those that might justify it as a practical matter. That is, there might be more political enthusiasm for using authority than was appropriate from a theoretical base, and that somehow or other one couldn't make that live unless one found a way to make the theoretical ideas about why it was important to conserve on and use the authority of the state carefully work politically. So what I want to say basically is that I want to talk about his contributions to criminal justice and criminology as important in their own right. But since I'm in this expansive mood these days, I was thinking we might want to notice that in doing this work, he revealed himself as something a little other than a disciplinary-based political scientist, right? And it's that little bit other than the disciplinary-based political scientist that was the inspiration and guide to me as we did our work. And the way in which it was other was that it became multidisciplinary and prescriptive, as well as disciplinary and descriptive. One of our speakers yesterday said that Mark Landy had said that Jim was always scrupulous in trying to keep his values out of the academic writings, right? He'd sworn allegiance, as we all had, to the idea of a value-free social science, right, at that time. But he was interested as an empirical phenomenon where values fit into social life. And he was interested in how values could be used to evaluate the conditions in which we were all living. And so they were never very far from his mind, and he was always a little bit preoccupied with the question about what was right action on the basis of both an individual's action as well as what constituted right action at the social and political level. And in that, he acted more like an old-fashioned political economist, right? One who was concerned about the moral sentiments of individuals as well as the moral conditions of society, as well as a new-fashioned empirical political scientist. And I think where all of his value and insights come in criminal justice as well as in political science, as well as in the broader world of public intellectuals, came from embracing the challenge of recovering a kind of political economy that was sort of going out of existence. And I valued him enormously for that and took a great deal of guidance. So what were the key elements of that? Well, I listed them in my paper. The first thing that you learn from Jim, I learned as a graduate student, was this commitment to empiricism. And I think that the first book he wrote on, it's interesting to go back and look at this stuff, because the first book he wrote on varieties of police behavior was an example of quite distinguished empirical work at the time. It was studying something that was at the core of political theory, which was could a public agency operate with a minimum amount of discretion, and if it had discretion, what did it end up doing with it? And so there was a lot to be learned from varieties of police behavior. But what was interesting to me about it was at least partly the normative frame of that book. And I remember years later we were on a panel on the National Academy of Sciences and reviewing police tactics and stuff like that. And I remember having a knockdown, drag-out fight with some of the people on the panel about whether the criteria that we should use to evaluate police performance would include only crime control effectiveness, or whether it would include the degree to which the police acted with legitimacy with legitimacy understood as an idealist concept or as a political concept, meaning with the consent of the people, right? And it seemed to me obvious that we had to have a normative framework that included those three things. And in the first writing, of course, Jim's work on, he was doing empirical work on what people later came to say was impossible to study empirically, namely the justice and fairness with which the police were operating. And that was being shoved aside in the interest of sort of constructing a theory or analysis of whether the police were effective in controlling crime. So even at the outset then, he starts doing this empirical work, but he does it from a normative frame, and then he gradually shifts into more active engagement with the normative framework of criminal justice policy as he begins getting involved in the practical world of politics. Now, I think Jim always had a slightly ambivalent relationship to the Kennedy School at Harvard, right? And the reason was in part that despite all his desire to participate actively in the politics of the time and policy debates of the time, he felt like he'd sworn allegiance to being an academic, right? And you had to leave your values at the door, and yeah, that was a big deal. And here was this upstart enterprise over here at the Kennedy School, and it was recklessly moving into a world where, how would you put it? If empiricism might still be present, but it sure as hell was trafficking in normative values as well as in pure social science, right? And I think that always made Jim get two distinctly different feelings about it. One was, yes, this is the right thing to do because as a logical matter, if we wish to engage in public policy discussion, there will be normative values at stake, right? And therefore we might as well be explicit and clear about that. And oh my God, this doesn't belong in the university, right? And he was standing on both of those things at the same time. I was teetering on the edge of those things all the time, and I remember going to him, as I mentioned in the paper, going to him for advice about how I could reconcile this. And he said, well, you're standing on two horses running at full speed in the opposite directions. He said, so keep your balance, Mark. He said, that wasn't the most helpful advice in that particular way. So the first thing was empiricism, but then an empiricism that was animated and guided and took seriously the values that were at stake that would make an empirical inquiry and important. What was interesting about it, the empirical question, was what implications it had for some important values in the world. The third thing then was this interest in individual moral agency and accountability, which he believed in as a fundamental feature of a liberal democratic society. I don't think he believed in it as a scientific fact, right? Because all of his work taught him that individuals, if they had moral agency, it was gained only with constant struggle in the development of your own character and the interaction with other people and stuff like that. So it was hard to create moral agency, that it didn't naturally exist. But I think in his theory of the right relationships that existed in a liberal democratic society, you had to assume that people had moral agency, and that otherwise you wouldn't have any idea about how to relate to one another. And the actual prospects for acting with moral agency would go down because whatever capabilities we had within ourselves to exercise restraint, to be self-conscious about what it is that we were doing and stuff would slacken, and with that our actual behavioral ability to behave the way we were supposed to behave would disappear. But once we have this idea that there were empirical facts and there was moral values, and as we were thinking about this in the context of the criminal justice system, there was this question about individual moral agency and the justice of calling people to account, the moral justice of calling people to account for bad acts, right, which actually is what criminal justice is sort of about. Then that cries out for some kind of legitimation, right? It just absolutely requires some kind of legitimation. And so then comes this awkward moment that sort of says, well, what would justify a collective to bring pressure to bear on an individual to think and behave in a particular way, right, that was non-criminal, say, and that would justify punishment if the person failed to do it? I mean, that's basically the question, right? And at that stage, this is where his thought, I think, gets into this question about material, solidary, and purposive incentives, which I think we quite appropriately focused on yesterday as an important part of his legacy. And we all have our little quarrels with it and stuff like that, so I'm going to quarrel with it a little bit in a minute here. But I think that one of the ways to understand that distinction is to say that when we're looking at a person who has solidary, I always thought it was weird that he used the phrase incentives rather than preferences, but never mind. We'll say material preferences. We're looking at what could easily be described as homo economicus, an individually self-centered person who wants material well-being. But as soon as we get out from that, from a solidary incentive or to a purpose incentive, we're looking at an individual that has preferences that are about the social conditions of what he or she is living, right? And the solidary incentives has to do with my affection for and relationship with you. The purpose incentives, as people were discussing yesterday, had to do with my vision of what constituted a good and just society. And that if we're going to live together in a community, and we're going to use the power of the state to regulate conditions and conduct in that world, then we probably have to be a little bit concerned about the construction of a moral order in which individuals have solidary and purposive incentives that are roughly aligned with one another, at least at some minimum basis. Because if they aren't roughly aligned with one another, then what could possibly be the justification for using state authority for? And this, I think, is related to the work that he later did on character and sort of the development of character as something that is, one way to think about it is that what character meant was that people who were working hard on their own motivations to be other-oriented and purposefully oriented, as well as materially self-oriented. So the issue then was, how could we construct a collective on the basis of these ideas about what we owe to one another? And notice what's interesting about it is that on the one hand, we believe that individuals are motivated by those ideas, and therefore we can use that as a basis for getting them into collective groups. And we can use the collective groups as a way of influencing government and legitimating government action, right? But the other thing is that each individual and all of us together can evaluate the condition of the society in light of those normal principles, right? And that was sort of the picture of a liberal democratic society. So he taught me a lot about how to think about social organization as a whole, as well as in criminal justice. And I think the basis of that was a capacity to connect the individual with the collective, the positive with the normative, the collective with the individual, the existing institutions with what could possibly be. And all of that gave us an enormous amount of freedom to work in search of a way to improve conditions both in the criminal justice system and through that, the society at large. In the end, I think what was interesting about his approach to criminal justice was that he saw it as both an instrument of the construction of a liberal community, but also as an expression of the liberal community, right? And the challenge of those manning the criminal justice system was to figure out how to let it be the expression of the best part of the liberal community, all right? And at the same time use it to construct the best possible kind of liberal community. That was what it was about. I think the thing that I wanted most, if I had him here with us today still, which I wish we still did have him with us, the thing I never quite had the courage to ask him, and that we didn't have the courage to face together, I don't think, was this incredibly hard problem about the criminal justice system in the United States, which was, I think we could both see what it would be like to have a good criminal justice system in a just society, and we could set out those principles. But what would a just criminal justice system look like if the society in which it was embedded was imperfectly just, or a little bit unjust in some of its ways, right? And I think that challenge would be a tough one for all of us to deal with and bear. And Jim got me part of the way down the path on that. He got me to a place where I could spend a lot of nights staying awake, worrying about that last question. And I just wish you were around now to ask him what he thinks the answer to that is. So thank you.
most dangerous place an academic ever occupied was following Jim Wilson. Following Mark Moore is just about as bad, so I hope you appreciate that courage. I'm not a political scientist, but one thing that Mark said that struck me very hard, he talked about Jim's empirical work. And it occurred to me that varieties of police behavior represents a tradition where empirical work meant paying attention to the phenomena rather than the statistical manipulation of data sets. If somebody in political science is going to do empirical work today, you ask, well, what data set are you starting with? I'm old-fashioned. I like the older tradition. But with that said, I want to talk about crime and punishment. This whole conference has some tension between the expression of filial piety and the expression of Oedipal rage. In my case, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because everything I want to criticize Jim about was stuff I followed him on. So I'm not asking where Jim went wrong, I'm asking where we went wrong, and I think John feels some of that as well. So let me first start with the good part. I mean, Jim was right, I think, to say that we didn't have enough punishment in 1975. We just had a spectacular crime wave, and we were debuilding prison capacity. Right? We had fewer prisoners and more criminals in 1975 than we had 15 years earlier, and crime was only getting worse. And Jim was surrounded by some good-hearted people who thought it wasn't nice to hurt people, and therefore we should be nice to criminals and maybe they'd stop committing crime. And Jim didn't have much patience with that. Again, I think correctly. And that's my comparison with Machiavelli. Machiavelli was also surrounded by good-hearted people who couldn't figure out that they had to do some rude things if they wanted to maintain power. And since their failure to maintain power had actually led to Machiavelli himself being tortured by the incoming Medici regime, he was a little annoyed about that. And so he was trying to teach good-hearted people to learn to be able not to be good, to use violence when and as necessary. And so a lot of us said, and again, following what Mark said, what do you do about justice in an unjust society? And Jim's answer and our answer was, well, whatever you do, it's not to subject the victims of injustice to more injustice. The primary victims of crime are people living in poor neighborhoods. And you're not nice to the people in those neighborhoods by not punishing the criminals among them. So again, a very Machiavellian point, that the apparent mercy of not punishing wrongdoers is actual cruelty to their much larger number of victims, right? That the effectual truth of soft-headed liberalism was victimization, and that was not justice toward the oppressed. And I don't think Jim ever quoted Sheldon Nolan, but it seems to me his thought about a crime was very much in line with Nolan's famous commentary on Machiavelli, whom he describes as pursuing an economy of violence, that is to say, a minimization of violence. But the right level of violence toward offenders is the one that minimizes total violence of punishment plus criminal victimization. And that again all seemed to me right, still seems to me more or less right, except here we are with mass incarceration, which none of us asked for or planned on. And it seems to me that most of us who followed Jim in demanding that we build some more prisons to hold the very bad people who are doing very bad things to other mostly underprivileged people. Most of us who said that back when there were about 500,000 Americans behind bars, right? We were at our historical level of about 120 or 140 prisoners per 100,000 population. put us a little high on the international league table, but not grossly high. Now we're at 750. We're at 5 times our historical level, 5 times the level of any other advanced country. And of course, that's enormously concentrated by race and by class. As the late lamented Bill Stuntz pointed out, the United States currently has an incarceration rate higher than the incarceration rate of the Soviet Union the day Stalin died. And it's getting to be harder to sing Land of the Free. But that's not the worst part of it. If you kind of look at, break it down by race, the African American incarceration rate is about 4,000 per 100,000, right? 4% of all African Americans right now are behind bars. Tolerable. And if you break it down further by class, it's even worse than that. An African American male who doesn't graduate from high school has a better than even chance of doing prison time, not jail time, prison time before he's 30. And so those of us who in 1980 were saying, hey, Jim Wilson's right, we need some more prisons here, are now looking around sort of like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Does this thing have an off switch? I mean, it looks like it does have an off switch called a fiscal crisis. Last year was the first year in 40 that the incarceration rate did not go up. But it's still astounding that now with crime rate down more than 50% from its peak, or we're now really back at 1965 levels of crime, and we're still at 5 times 1965 levels of incarceration, and nobody's planning to get back. Now, Jim was not unaware of this. The last lecture I heard him give, he told the crowd at the Ronald Reagan Library that mass incarceration was now a social evil comparable to the evil of crime. I don't think that's what that crowd was expecting to hear. Still raises the question, where did we go wrong? Right? We can see it now. Why did we see it then? What did we miss? And again, I want to get back to Machiavelli. Machiavelli discusses punishment, frankly. He's so frank that the word he uses is crudelta, is cruelty. And he never talks about punishment. He talks about cruelty or severity. And he acknowledges that cruelty is the name of a vice. When he talks about cruelty well used, he immediately adds a parenthetical. If it is licit to speak well of evil. That's, it seems to me, something that we missed. We were prepared, sort of in economic mode, to treat punishment as a cost. Of something you'd rather not do. We'd like to do as little of as possible. But if the result is saving more violence somewhere else, well then, go ahead and do it. And don't apologize for it. And again, to Mark's point, the more you insist that the punishment, the cruelty, is justly inflicted, because people, after all, are responsible for their own actions, the more you insist on that, the more you lose sight of the fact that you're deliberately damaging human beings. And the point that George Bernard Shaw stole from Plato, which is that damaging human beings is not generally a way to improve them. And therefore, rehabilitative punishment is something of an oxymoron. Once you understand cruelty, punishment as a vice, you notice that we're not using machines to do it, we're using human beings. And if we change our institutions and the people who govern our institutions to be less merciful and more cruel, we're having an effect on the system and not just on the criminals. And that's not a good effect. The other thing Machiavelli says about cruelty is that there's a rule for determining where it's being well used and where it's being badly used. And the rule is that if it's being well used, it happens all at once and declines sharply thereafter. And so, as soon as we had rising incarceration in the face of falling crime, an alarm bell should have gone off. That we weren't using cruelty well, and that in fact, like any other vice, it had led us down the path of excess. What else did we miss? We missed the notion that if punishment is well used in a different sense, it can actually foster the moral sense. Jim was aware of the point first made by Cesare Beccaria that swiftness and certainty are more important than severity in determining the deterrent efficacy of punishment. Now, his interest in incapacitation somewhat elided that point, but he was perfectly aware of it, and of the related point, which I stole without crediting him, that severity is the enemy of swiftness and certainty. And so that leads you to think about how you can do punishment more swiftly and certainly, which led to the notion of swift and certain sanctions in community corrections. And Jim was delighted to find that stuff had worked. But I think what my first analysis of that missed was the moral sense point. That if you deliver punishments swiftly and certainly and predictably and fairly and with explicit warning and in a context of explicit goodwill, like the first sentence in Judge Ahm's speech to the new participants in the HOPE program is, everyone in this courtroom wants you to succeed on probation. That if you do it in that context, you can actually change people's capacity for self-command. Right? The moral sense in the grand way can seem quite ethereal and noble. But conscience has also been defined as the still, small voice that tells you someone might be watching. And the extent to which the criminal justice system can do the parenting job by creating a predictable environment, including predictable but not vicious punishments, that we can get punishment away from cruelty, and therefore change the capacity of people who are now offenders to control their own behavior in their own interest and in the service of our social goals. That, it seems to me, something that most of us missed, and I now want to claim is the way out of our box, the way to have less crime and less punishment. What Wilson was aware of, far more than his liberal criminology rivals, was the biological basis of crime. I think a lot of people found Crime and Human Nature both a very conservative book and a very weird book. Very weird because it treated human beings as animals, whose behavior was subject to biological laws rather than moral laws. And conservative because it was in contradiction to an imagined liberal perfectionism that thought that people could be made better by being nice to them. And there's a piece of that there. But let's think about the implications of the constitutional factors analysis of crime. It says, look, yes, some people have weaker moral senses than others for reasons that go fairly deep into their biology, that aren't directly functions of their choice. Well, suddenly if you say, we should get lead out of the environment because lead is furiously criminogenic, well, that's a perfectly natural thing to say. Well, that sounds like environmental management to me. If you say, fetal exposure to alcohol is a real risk factor for people who will never be able to exercise good self-command. And acute exposure to lots of alcohol causes lots of people to lose self-command in ways that lead them to commit crime. Then it seems like raising alcohol taxes might be a smart thing to do to control crime. If people are criminal partly because they have poor self-command, partly because they had bad parenting, then investing public resources in providing parent coaches to young, first-time, poorly educated, at-risk mothers, the nurse-family partnership program. Well, that might sound like a crime control idea, too. So, the constitutional factors theory of crime leads you straight toward liberal social engineering. And Jim didn't duck that. He thought all of those were terrific ideas. So, as another public intellectual might have said, James Q. Wilson was not against all liberal social programs. He was only against dumb liberal social programs. Thank you.
You sit long enough and you get stiff. I'm not a political scientist like the second Mark. I'm a social worker. I have my master's in social work. I'm trained as a child therapist, and I have my PhD in social work. I've never taken a course in political science. No political scientists are amongst my close friends. And so if political science language is used in the conversation, I might need help in translating it to my background and experience. As my colleagues who I've worked with over the years at the table will tell you, I think in terms of anecdotes and stories. I don't think as much sequentially as around a story, and so I want to tell you a story about the development of an idea. And I use the word development because the idea of order maintenance was not new with broken windows. Jim had written about it earlier in Varieties. A lot of police practiced it. Bratton later became commissioner, was experimenting with that model in Fenway. So what Jim and I did was to catch a wind, and I'd like to talk about how that happened. In 1970, the Ford Foundation created the Police Foundation and gave it $30 million. Think of that in terms of 1970 money, and you can imagine what a delight it was to work for that organization at that particular time. Jim was on the board of the organization, and I got one of the first large grants to conduct an experiment in Kansas City, Missouri. It was the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment, and basically what we looked at was variations of level of patrol to see whether riding around in cars made any difference. And our conclusion was that it didn't make much difference. A well-noted sociologist did everything he could to block the publication of that study, and was successfully leading the charge on not publishing that study. And Jim intervened as a board member. And it was my first contact beyond just sitting in front of him at board meetings when Jim came to the defense of the Kansas City study, and ultimately it was published. And I followed that by doing the Newark Foot Patrol study. And in the Foot Patrol study, what we discovered was that if you add foot patrols to neighborhoods, fear of crime goes down. If you take foot patrol away, fear of crime declines. The issue was, why did fear of crime decline in neighborhoods where there were foot patrol, when it was maybe 30 hours a week that foot patrol officers were out there? And to answer that question, Mark Moore convened a brown bag lunch at the Kennedy School. And if you know my field, or my adopted field, criminology, very well, you will recognize these names. He put together a panel that included Mark, Lloyd Olin, Egon Bittner, Don Black, Walter Miller. These were the elite criminologists of the time. And it was Egon Bittner who kept saying to me, George, go back to your field notes. What did the police do? What were they doing? And I followed his advice, and what I found was that the police were primarily, when on foot patrol, were primarily involved in order maintenance activities. I published the study, and in the final chapter I wrote about the police basically conducting order maintenance activities. I got a call shortly after it was published from Jim, congratulating me on the study, commenting on the last chapter, and asking me if I'd like to do a paper with him. The Atlantic had contacted him, and would I like to co-author a piece with him. I was honored, I was delighted. I demurred in the sense that I said to Jim, all you have to do is cite me. I'd be honored if you'd cite me. But Jim, as always generous, said to me, George, let's do it together. Get down all the things you'd like to have in the study or in the article and forward them to me, and then we'll work on it from there. And as many of you know, it came out called Broken Windows, and Broken Windows was a metaphor. And whenever I talk about it, I make sure that people understand that the idea of that metaphor was totally Jim's. Jim brought that metaphor to the article, and it was one of the things that I think has helped the dissemination of the idea a lot. But those of you who know about metaphors know that while they can help you very much in communicating ideas, they terribly oversimplify ideas at the same time, and pretty soon everyone knows what the metaphor means. Whether they know it or not is oftentimes subject to some debate. The article immediately got attention, primarily from police and primarily from community groups. Police would responded to it very quickly by saying, you know, this is really right, but we have to stay out on patrol, we have to respond rapidly to calls for service. We just don't have the time to do these kinds of activities. Community groups, to my surprise, got a hold of it very, very quickly. And during the summer of '82, I was visiting community groups in Boston, and if it happened to me once, it happened to me 4 or 5 times, I'd ask them, what kinds of things are you interested in? And somebody would go and grab some papers and hand them to me and say, if you want to know what we're concerned about, read this. And they'd hand me a copy of Broken Windows. And they said, you know, please come and they visit with us, and they bring their crime stats. And they're interesting, but my kids can't play in the playground anymore because of youths drinking in the park. My husband is being hustled by prostitutes in front of my children. These were the kinds of concerns that citizens had, and the police were ignoring them. We got a few minor responses from academics, but basically things were fairly quiet. In 1989, I was invited by Bob Kelling, some of you might know Bob, who was head of the New York State Transportation Authority, to deal with the problem, and now please hear quotes, of homelessness in the subway. The New York Times, the police, the Transit Authority, everyone agreed that homelessness was a major problem in the New York City subway and was interfering with the reclamation of the subway, in which they'd spent $8 billion, new tracks, new equipment, etc., that was all under threat by homelessness. Well, it didn't, if you went to the ground, if you went underground in that case, it didn't take very long to see that this wasn't homelessness. When 250,000 people a day were going under or over the turnstiles, when people were stalking the toll booths, this was lawlessness. It wasn't homelessness. Sure, there was some homelessness, but basically it was lawlessness. Well, now, and many of you know, Broken Windows was applied. Bratton was recruited from the Boston area to take over the transit police at the time. Order was restored within a matter of months. Bratton returned to Boston, returned to New York, and there took over the New York City Police, and as a floor, had an idea of Broken Windows supported by Giuliani. The delight, can you imagine, you're a semi-academician, as I has always been. I'm as much social worker as academician, I think. Having the subway of New York City as a pretest and getting New York City itself as a test for a particular idea. And Jim's position, as I speculated, was pretty much to turn Broken Windows over to me. If there were calls about it, he'd refer them to me. If there were invitations to speak about Broken Windows, he'd refer them to me. It was part of the ongoing generosity of Jim. And as you know, now the good news was it received a lot of publicity in the subway in New York City. The bad news was it attracted a lot of publicity because it certainly attracted a large number of critics who referred to what Jim and I were talking about as criminalization of the poor and those kinds of issues. From my point of view, order maintenance is a very, very powerful tool. It has to be used very, very cautiously. Order maintenance activities were used to enforce the black codes that kept African Americans in slavery through the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. If you're not aware of that, you shouldn't be trying aggressive order maintenance activities because you will change your approach substantially. If there aren't good guidelines, and if you want to read about guidelines, go back to Varieties of Police Experience, where Jim wrote an article, in the conclusion is applicable as today, and the issues that we're fighting about today and wrestling about today and wrestling with today as they were when Jim wrote them. A final comment. There have now been several experiments, aside from all the anecdotal evidence and all the case examples of the success of broken windows. There are now at least 2 experiments, one in Jersey City and one in Lowell, Massachusetts, that link order maintenance activities to reduction in crime. Is it absolutely proven at the present time? No, I don't think so. But I think the burden of proof has switched to the other side. If you don't think it works, it's up to you now to demonstrate that it doesn't work. We have enough evidence that it does work. The last thing that I wrote with Jim was probably 4 or 5 years ago. Jim, at that point, became impatient with many of the critics. For the first time, I saw Jim write about and critique people who were critiquing him and do it quite aggressively. And what he was struck by was the extent to which critics of broken windows were eager to identify studies that put broken windows policing in doubt, but ignored the studies that supported broken windows. I was extraordinarily fortunate to deal with the generosity of Jim. He was extraordinarily generous. We never guessed when Broken Windows was published that it would have the legs that it did. About a year and a half ago, I think it was that recently, or before Jim died, with one of the occasional royalty checks that Jim would send me, he just sent a little note and said, "Hasn't everyone read this already?" I think the argument, and again, I'm going to use Jim's language now, that the value of order is self-evident. The link between and the value of the reduction of fear is self-evident. The link between disorder and crime is what really needs evidence and proof, and we think we've moved a long way in that direction. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thanks so much. So